Hi, I want to welcome you to our next session, Continuous Cloud Security and Compliance for Healthcare and Life Sciences. Some background here. When it comes to the security and compliance of your enterprise cloud, healthcare and life sciences organizations need to have an integrated, automated, enterprise-wide, multi-cloud approach to assure regulatory compliance and complex data protection. In this session, Thomas Martin, founder at NephōSec and former CIO at GE, along with Chris Hertz, Vice President Cloud Security Sales at DiviCloud by Rapid7, are going to review the latest trends in cloud risk for healthcare and how to achieve continuous full lifecycle security and compliance from multi-cloud environments. With that, let me turn this over to Thomas and to Chris. Gentlemen.
Hello, how are you? Welcome.
Thank you, Tom.
So I think I need to share my screen here and get this going. Can everyone see my screen?
Sure can.
Perfect, wonderful. Well, thanks for joining us today, everybody. My name is Christopher Hertz. As mentioned, I'm the VP of Cloud Security Sales for DiviCloud by Rapid7. Spent the last 20 years helping customers adopt emerging technology securely, and in the last decade or so on the public cloud side, largely around the Microsoft stack for many years, but now with DiviCloud really in the multi-cloud world. And also want to introduce Thomas Martin. Thomas, do you want to quickly give an introduction for yourself?
Yeah, sure will. Thanks, Chris and Tom. Yes, Thomas Martin. I spent about 25 years with General Electric in multiple capacities across mostly the industrial businesses, but worked in various CIO and CTO capacities. But the past 3 or 4 years now have been specifically focused on cloud-based security. And really that stemmed from the time of us actually moving about 9,000 workloads over to AWS. But now we're working in both AWS, Azure, as well as GCP. So
wonderful. Well, thanks, Thomas. Excited to be here. And let's talk about the sort of issues specific to health and life sciences. You know, we have a number of customers at DiviCloud in health and life sciences. I've worked with a number of customers over the years in terms of digital transformation, as I know you have as well, who've been on the health and life sciences side. And, you know, that can range from pharmaceutical companies to biotech, to hospitals, to healthcare insurers, right? You sort of running the gamut. And, you know, in all of that, there's a digital transformation effort underway right now that is in response to consumer demand for improved experience delivered sort of when they want it, how they want it. And then in addition, because there's all this innovation that these companies can unlock due to the processing scale and the access to sort of best-in-class, always available resources from cloud providers. So the combination of consumer demand with, for new and sort of novel ways to consume services, along with just the opportunity to drive innovation, maybe that's product development, maybe it's, it's drug development, it could be any number of things, right? Those two things are really driving it. But, you know, my experience is that digital transformation comes with uncertainty and risk. And, Thomas, let's talk a little bit about what that looks like. Let me set the table, and I'd love your view of that as well.
Sure.
What we see is that for our health and life science customers, they've traditionally thought of risk as a two-dimensional problem, right? They've got technology innovation, they've got time, they've got sort of the managed security risk that they have, and they have all this risk created by the pace of innovation, which is something they need to close because those gaps are enormous and they create huge problems. In 2018, we identified 81 major breaches due to cloud misconfigurations. In 2019, there were 115, a 42% increase. And what we've estimated is that between 2018 and 2019 alone, 5 trillion worth of damage was done due to cloud misconfigurations. And part of that is that actually what we view and what we hear from customers all the time is that this risk is three-dimensional. And it's three-dimensional because it's incredibly complicated. Not only do you have technology innovation, right, but you have speed accelerating of that innovation. Like people are shrinking the horizon of how quickly they do things. You layer on top of that what's happening right now with the pandemic, and that's creating unplanned digital and workforce disruption. But on top of that, cloud services are not static. They are themselves constantly evolve. So you can't just say, well, I'm using this one cloud service, it will remain the same. No, it's constantly evolving. The people who are consuming cloud services inside of these organizations, inside of HLS organizations, also are constantly changing. You're going from a small group of people who have command control to dozens, if not hundreds, if not thousands of people who now have control over cloud and container environments. what else have you seen there, Thomas? Like, why is this three-dimensional? Why is it so hard for people to get their heads around, especially in the health and life sciences world?
Sure. Well, and I think you really hit it earlier with that. It's no longer just an internal management of assets and your supply chain internally. There's this whole consumer aspect to it now in trying to manage the patient experience, and that's certainly beyond just EMR and medical records. I think it goes to the flow. You almost think of the individual consumer as being an edge device now. On how they're flowing through the hospital. So, I mean, suddenly cloud is becoming ubiquitous, if you will, in the overall medical field.
Well, and I think, going to that point, you also have, let's just say, and this is true across all of health life sciences, right? Hospitals have challenges. Sure. Certainly pharmaceutical companies do, biotech, right? And, health insurers, you sort of broadly group everybody in there in health life sciences. Part of it is also self-service access, right? That suddenly for the first time, people have self-service access to cloud. They can provision cloud resources. When I talk about cloud, I'm talking more about infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, functions as a service, containers as a service. So your traditional Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud Platform, Alibaba Cloud, not so much SaaS, right? SaaS certainly has these problems as well. I think it's slightly different. So when I think about cloud and sort of cloud security gap, that's what I'm thinking about. And self-service access to the configuration, provisioning of resources inside of that is incredibly complex.
Absolutely.
And I think what we've seen, and I'll throw this back to you, what we did a poll of close to 2,000 IT professionals over in 2019. We published it, and you certainly can access this publication as well. 42% of the IT professionals we surveyed do not know which frameworks their company uses to maintain compliance and standards regulation. And yet, if we've democratized security by democratizing self-service access to cloud services,
right,
this is a huge issue, right? So talk to me a little bit about that. How do you see this manifest in the world that you experience as you work with customers through digital transformation?
Yeah, it's not specific to the health and life sciences field. Pick your vertical. This is a true challenge across really the IT industry and how folks, particularly application teams, I would say, are going through this process and what I call crossing the chasm of knowledge.
Yeah.
And really beginning to understand not only how to utilize these resources in the public cloud, but how to secure them and what framework should be applied to do that. And as you mentioned, I think just understanding the regulations tied to meeting the security realm around HIPAA is just one example. We've got to be able to, as you said, as we democratize, we've also got to educate and help folks understand the framework that we're trying to work under.
Yeah, well, and I think you raise a good point there. I mean, it's not only just knowing, oh, well, I'm under HIPAA, right? Well, healthcare, okay, that's probably true. Right. But maybe also as a company, we have SOC 2 or ISO 27001 or NIST CSF, the cybersecurity framework, or the Cloud Security Alliance Cloud Controls Matrix. All these are things that we could have adopted as corporate standards, and many people do, or the CIS benchmarks, right? For AWS or Azure or GCP. And I think beyond that, the challenge is understanding how those things operate in the shared responsibility model of public cloud, right? So again, it's not just that IT professionals don't know which framework to use, it's how does that even apply to cloud? How does it apply to me and how I operate in the cloud? Because the cloud itself is secure. It's my operation of the cloud that leads to misconfigurations. And what was interesting is that even when we found that that people did use standards, right? That they had a framework, they were aware of it. We found that many people, in 25% of those cases, they still were not enforced.
Yeah.
Right. So it goes beyond. So it's the first layer of like, okay, I'm aware of it. Second layer is how do I apply it to cloud? How do I apply it to, in other words, how does HIPAA actually interact with cloud from the shared responsibility model? How do I then implement that in my development of applications or operations of cloud as an individual? And also, is that thing actually tracked? Is there a trust but verify mechanism in place?
Right.
And if all those things aren't there, well, then you're going back to this enormous security achievement gap that functionally isn't being secured, right? Sure. And that's where you get all these breaches that occur. And so the other part that we run into constantly, Thomas, is developers and security being misaligned, because we talked about this earlier. You have this democratization of access to cloud, right? So you have self-service access, but that means you have to democratize security, right? And so talk a little bit, how do we see, I mean, I see this a lot, but tell me if you see it. People seem to be trapped still in the way they did business from the data center world and trying to apply that, and how that maybe is problematic in creating this misalignment.
Well, and I think it stems back to, in that data center world, right, that generally with the enterprise, that typically corporate information security was a very centralized function. So it was come, check in, get that approval, and then with that approval, execute. Yep. And as we've democratized access, that also means that we're going to have to democratize security. I mean, everyone truly in the organization is responsible for the security of the company's assets and our consumers' data. And with that comes education, but it also comes with that understanding that you're part of that chain. And I think it's important for organizations that have those central teams to look at it in two ways. Yes, I think the central team is still responsible for setting those governance benchmarks, having documents to follow and frameworks that are agreed upon. But it's also about embedding some of those folks out with the application teams and helping them understand how to remain compliant.
Yeah, and look, what we found in our survey from last year was that 49%, almost half of respondents who use public cloud, said that developers and engineers at times ignore or circumvent cloud security and compliance policies. And I think this is not because anyone maliciously wants to do that. I mean, I've never met a developer who said, hey, I don't want to be part of security. Instead, it's this misalignment that you just described, which is that if the way you do cloud security is still focused on sort of a command and control mechanism,
right,
well, that's very problematic, because then if you're a rock in the river and you're creating friction, and you're essentially reversing everything that cloud adoption means. Cloud adoption means agility. And so if your mechanism is everything has to go through me to approve, well, you've created this choke point that now people are eventually going to flow around, right? Water flows around stones. And so they're going to do it out of necessity, not because they're mean-spirited, but because you simply haven't adjusted the organization, the culture, the processes, and the technology to support all of that in a way that supports the way you have to be agile, right? You have to be and we'll talk about this a little bit. You mentioned, the agile transformation, right? The sort of organizational realignment that needs to occur. And then secondly, often traditionally, and we'll talk about this a little bit towards the end, cloud security has manifested itself at runtime.
Right.
And fundamentally, if I'm a developer, I'm operating in DevOps. Like I'm in my pipeline, ideally, right? And we'll talk about the use of pipelines. I may be using infrastructure as code. But functionally, if I'm being presented with a misconfiguration or policy violation or problem at runtime, that's not where I operate. I don't function there. And so you again are presenting this, and by the way, that may be ephemeral. So me fixing it there doesn't solve anything, because actually it's going to be rebuilt by that same infrastructure as code template. My Terraform plan's going to rebuild that in 3 hours, and the same problem. And you're going to come and say, Thomas, you're the security guy, coming to meet Chris and say, Chris, that problem re-existed. And eventually I'm going to say, forget this. I'm done with you. And I'm going to call you a 4-letter word, and we're going to be at loggerheads. And that's part of, I think there's this big what do we do? We have to take cloud security, we have to shift it left into the DevOps. We have to make cloud security part of DevSecOps, so that we're delivering education and feedback and manifestation of the problem and the resolution of it during that DevOps stage. So it's the right place at the right time with the right people.
Absolutely. And it has to be that full life cycle, right? It has to your point, it can't be an afterthought. It
can't be an afterthought. That's right. So talk about that. So here, you touched on this earlier. You started talking about agile transformation, embedding people. We've often seen the Cloud Center of Excellence been created as part of a digital transformation effort, but then actually persists as almost an agile transformer longer term. And I've always had this conversation where people are like, oh, CCOEs will go away eventually, right? But actually, they seem to have a lot of longevity. Can you talk about how you've seen CCOEs been used and how they've been effective in long term in some of the organizations?
Sure. Well, first off, right, I mean, and I'm not saying this is in all organizations, but they particularly, they can't, security can't be viewed as the department of no, right? It has to be viewed as we have to remain secure, so let's figure out how we get there together. And I think, as we talked a little bit, earlier, and I think we're really seeing this, but, particularly in the work that you guys are doing at DivvyCloud, is this whole real shift left to not only look at the runtime later, but really early on, showing the development teams through their Terraform plans about, as they're looking to roll this out, what effectively goes against policy. And I think having both, the right level of security individuals as well as solution architects that really understand the planned Lego brick construct, if you will, early in the process does a lot to shift culture around helping folks understand not only really the desired outcome, but also the how. And I think by having that early in the life cycle, folks learn it. And then once things are deployed, there's still that opportunity, right, for things to become misconfigured if they're sustaining long-running resources. And I think that's where you have to have both sides of the full life cycle, which is helping understand prior to deployment, but also monitoring long-term under runtime.
Yeah, so let me recap to some extent, right? First, CCOs are great because they can be these agile transformers. If you don't have one, that's okay, but you still need to think about somebody in the organization needs to have that agile transformer function, like you played at GE, right?
Sure.
I mean, you're helping to reinvent how we do, you're reinventing the culture, right? It's becoming more inclusive, so we're democratizing security. So it's moving from command and control to trust but verify. It's supporting that by leaning in, maybe embedding people and processes into this. It's the use of automation, right? Yeah. So it's are we using pipelines as part of DevOps? If we're not, let's do that. Are we using infrastructure as code? Because man, is that a benefit? Now be careful, because
right.
if you do
you touched on it before,
you can actually scale problems very rapidly, right? So someone was telling me the other day they heard from a customer and they said, "Oh, we're deploying Terraform. We're going to use it organizational wide. Great. Now I have the ability to create enormous security risks at scale, right?
Yeah, right, at scale.
At scale, right? So I mean, be careful. You got to marry. Again, you want to use pipelines and you want to use automation. You want to use IAC, but remember, you can take one misconfigured plan that has misconfiguration or 10 and you can scale that out to 100 environments like that. So these also can create increased risk. So you need to marry that with security not being afterthought. As you lay in pipelines, as you lay in Terraform plans or CloudFormation templates or ARM, you need to be baking this into that process. And then last but not least, and I'd love to talk to you about this, is you have to have a regulator approach, right? An auditor approach, because cloud looks different. We had a regulated customer that came to us and said, they had an auditor come through and say, "Hey, can you show me this thing?" And they said, "Well, it's a Lambda function. It only fires when it's called."
Right.
And the person said, "So call it." And they said, "But no, no one's calling it right now." And it became this weird thing where, if you're not getting ahead of your auditor or regulatory process, if you're not leading those people, if you're not educating them, I think you're going to end up in a lot of places where they might try and limit you or they don't understand what you're doing. And so I do think that it needs to be something where regulated organizations are really educating their regulators and their auditors. Talking about how you see that yourself.
Yeah, well, I think it's a few different areas. One is being, to your point, in many cases the written regulations in many cases haven't even caught up, right, with cloud as how it gets interpreted. And I think it's important to go through each of those regulations and look at it in many cases. If it's not specific, it's at least have an interpretation and document it and consistently follow it. Yeah. And then look, if something comes up, at least it's a discussion that you can show. We not only have a policy around it, but we track it. And I think the one other thing that ties into the earlier discussion is not every environment should be treated equally. And what I mean by that is, and it's kind of this, the constraints in some way should tighten as you go towards production. I'm not saying that in cloud you need to have 5 different environments. There's at least a non-prod and a prod, but in generally there should also be that sandbox area where you are allowing folks to innovate. Yeah. And if those areas aren't touching, anything that's related to external or don't contain, actual,
PHI or PII,
data, right? Allow them to somewhat run free. But as you're heading towards, that's where the restrictions need, around what can be done, what systems can talk between one another, how data is classified become very important. And that's where you have to be, to your point, very, very rigorous, not only in how you track it, but ability to audit.
Yeah, well, let's talk through what you just described. First of all, I think, for a lot of folks, when we see people struggling with how do they get to continuous security compliance, there's sort of a few layers, right? There's one, you need visibility of what's happening in cloud, right? And that is both during the DevOps stage, but then also into runtime. So you need visibility. You need to be able to identify and assess risk.
Mm-hmm.
You need to be able to prioritize that risk, and you need to be able to remediate it. And you want to automate that and be able to express policies, as you said, I think really well. You need to be able to have those policies documented. So you can say, here's how I've taken these standards and regulations, let's say this directive within HIPAA, and how I've translated operationally to not just one cloud, but all my clouds consistently.
Yes.
And then let me be able to show that to you as an auditor or as a regulator or simply as another stakeholder within my organization or my customers possibly, right?
Mm-hmm.
And say, or partners, and say, this is how we have approached cloud security and how we've operationalized it. So it is not a one-time event. I think there's a few things that we'll run through. One, pay close attention to things that store data. Obviously, I mean, this seems like an obvious thing, but
but it's the one that continuously gets breached.
It
right?
does, and don't forget about IaaS, infrastructure as service, right? People often think about, oh, well, everything's going towards containers and everything's going towards serverless, but actually, when we surveyed our the 2,000 IT professionals, the plurality of net new applications that are being built on IaaS. So as much as the hot topic is serverless and containers, don't forget that most things are still compute. And then on top of that, pay close to, of the breaches that happened, I think in 2019 and 2018, 44% were Elasticsearch, 16% were S3 bucket, and 12% were MongoDB. Everyone always talks about S3 buckets on Amazon, but man, those search and cache instances catch you every time.
Yeah.
If someone attaches it, sucks some data down, doesn't remember that it's cached. And then let's talk through a few sort of just specific things people can do. One, plan for the worst and know the blast radius. Can you riff on that for a couple of minutes or a minute or two, just on sort of what that means to you?
Yeah, and it's a term that I've always utilized with teams because I think it's one that they can understand easily. And if you think back to those data center days, right? I mean, everybody was all about perimeter. But the biggest thing is, as you thought about, what's the blast rate? If something does occur, how far can it reach? And I'll go as simple as you walk out of the data center, guess what? There's that big red button for an emergency, and that blast radius is the entire data center. Come back to, as you think about cloud, it's really what are all of the things that this service, this individual resource, or this service account, or whatever the assumed role this role has. What can it touch? How far can it go? And what permissions does it have? And when you begin to think about applications in that sense, you can really, you plan for the worst of how far can it go, and you fully understand the breadth of, or how deep that actual breach can touch.
Well, and I think that ties really into the next one, which is focus on risks and not threats, which is, you think about cloud, and I think you just touched on this in a way, which is, the perimeter is really identity access management now.
Absolutely.
The new perimeter, right? It's porous, right? Yes, you can have firewalls in the cloud.
It's dynamic.
But
people come, people go. Roles come, roles go.
Everything has a role, right? Everything has an identity. Like, it's no longer just individuals. It can be cloud services. It can be, policies. It can be all sorts of things that happen there. And so, first and foremost, it's about how do you focus on, and threat actors are great. We want to constantly be aware of that. Red teams are amazing, and they play an important role. But fundamentally, can you reduce your attack surface by reducing risk? And in the cloud, most risk becomes on how we misconfigure, how we poorly operate the cloud. So if you can strengthen how you operate the cloud, if you can reduce risk, well, your attack surface shrinks, which means you have to worry less about threats. Because you have a smaller attack. And by the way, your blast radius is also shrunk.
Right.
Now, what does that look like in the cloud? Let's be very specific. First, it's, can you detect publicly exposed assets, right? Two, can you identify excessive and unused permissions? Because again, we just talked about IAM. Have you been able to confirm you have harder security configs? Are you securing APIs? And are you automating all of this, again, this visibility, assessment, prioritization, remediation process and proof of all those things. And if you can do all those things, well, then you've reduced, again, that attack surface allows you to be a little more confident in your ability to ward off attacks. And then when one is successful, well, your blast radius is smaller, right? What's exposed is less. We've talked a lot about shifting cloud security left, but again, take those same policies that you're enforcing at runtime, move them in the CI/CD process, and ideally deliver better experiences to developers, make them more productive because you're you're educating them and making them participate. And by the way, they're more likely to participate, which improves security altogether. Plus, you can actually stop misconfigurations happening by stopping the build. So you can actually say, hey, if that Terraform plan would result in the manifestation of risk, don't build. Right?
What's the easiest problem to fix? It's the one that never happened, right?
And
it's also the least expensive to fix,
yes,
because it's so far left in the process.
And you fix it one time, and now you fix that source plan that might have been replicating problems and ephemeral problems constantly, right? And the last one is automate. I mean, this is really, we talked about this. It's can use pipelines, can use tools like infrastructure as code, and can you use products, frankly, like DivvyCloud, which is cloud security posture management, to automate, again, everything we just talked about. And so just for folks who are unfamiliar with us, just real quick topic here, and just say, DivvyCloud by Rapid7, we're a cloud security posture management product. Our goal is to help customers accelerate innovation using cloud and container services without the loss of control. So it's how do you embrace self-service access to software-defined infrastructure in a way that protects it from misconfigurations, policy violations, threats, and identity and access management challenges across certainly depth in one cloud, but across multi-cloud. So across Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud Platform, Alibaba Cloud, and Kubernetes, which we see as another cloud infrastructure layer. And importantly, for us, we're doing two things. We're able to take your CI/CD pipeline. You're able to pipe us things like Terraform plan. We're able to evaluate that and actually prevent misconfigurations from occurring, but we're also able to see everything that's happening at runtime, every change, every new creation or modification or deletion, and evaluate that against things like HIPAA, right? Or SOC 2 or ISO 27001 or the CS benchmarks. We have hundreds of policies out of the package. You can configure all those as well. So it really gives you the flexibility to adapt a product to operationalize all of your standards throughout that full life cycle. We have a whole swath of customers we service. They're all amazing, including many who we can't talk about necessarily publicly in the health and life sciences space. But if you do want to have the ability to gain freedom to innovate without loss of control today, we do offer a free 30-day trial of DivvyCloud. That's DivvyCloud.com/free trial. We'd love to hear from you and help you in your cloud journey, whether it's at the very beginning or whether you're in the advanced stages where you just need help, again, maturing. And now we'll switch to questions. So thanks so much for your time today, Thomas.
Gladly, and really anxious to hear what the team has to ask.
Well, very good, Chris. Thomas, thanks so much for your time and insight today. As you say, we have the opportunity to take some questions now. I'm sure some questions have come in. So look forward to the queries from the attendees and for the sessions that we continue on throughout the day. So thank you so much.
Perfect.
Thank you.